Okay, I think we're good.
Great.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Chaslin from the Upper Skagit Library, and today I have Jordan with me. And Jordan and I went to the same school. And one of the things that I found really interesting about going to this school was that I had a professor, and Jordan, I think, had the same professor,
Yeah.
who actually incorporated fandom, fan culture, fan art, fan works into his classes. And that's how we were introduced, was through this professor, I think after our school years.
Yeah.
So for me, that was super interesting because I started out as a young kid in fandom, and it was like a solo experience. You read fan fiction, you read fan art, but you didn't really participate much. And it was only as I got older and these more websites started popping out that were interactive, the Twitters and the Tumblrs and everything. Once we moved past like GeoCities and and our
Yeah.
individual our individual websites where you were maybe lucky if somebody like found your website. But it was only as I got into high school and college that fandom really became more interactive. And when I went to Professor Hedges's classes, that was the first time I'd ever seen anyone take fandom seriously in an academic standpoint. So I wonder if it was the same experience for you?
Yeah, very much so. I think, and before I never even really heard the term fandom. It was sort of like, oh, you're a nerdy person, you watch Star Trek or you read, sci-fi or fantasy books, or you like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I had no idea. I basically, other than a few friends, really, it was a pretty sort of like I was the only person doing those things.
Mm.
And I get to college, and actually, funny enough, before I started taking classes with Warren, because my college was sort of split up into two eras.
Mm.
I left and came back. I actually went to a discussion by Warren's partner, another professor at the university.
Oh.
Um, and because I worked with our queer resource center, and I got introduced to this idea of queerness and fandom, and that there's this whole world of other people who are looking at the things we like, and you know um, reading in and sort of replacing, where are queer people in fandom, how maybe we can read text differently, where it's like, oh, I'm not the only person who maybe sees these two characters having an intimate relationship, even though the text maybe doesn't explicitly say it, and learning
Mhm.
terms like shipping. And so then, from there, making that connection. And then when I came back to finish my degree, realizing, that there's this, that I can essentially basically get a degree in this, and that it's not just, it's not just something that you can nerd out by yourself on, but there's this whole academic world and these communities that are sort of doing all these things.
Mhm. I love it. I mean, and it's interesting too because I did an interview with someone else on the fandom topic as well, and we kind of came to the conclusion that you could study fandom culture through kind of an anthropology lens. So I saw the term the other day, was fanthropology, which I just
Mm-hmm.
found absolutely adorable. But it's with fandom, it is a really interesting way to study representation, in ways that may be more approachable to some people who aren't like hardcore into anthropology, or maybe have just never experienced it for themselves. So when you studied, so did you actually really go hardcore into studying representation through fandom? Is that something you really focused in on?
Yeah, and I got at the university we went to. There's the emerging media and digital art degree, um, and for me, uh, I sort of contextualize it rather than specifically studying fandoms, like instead of studying, say, the fans of Star Trek or the fans of Voltron. I took more of a cultural studies sort of approach and looked at how fans build these complex story worlds around the things they love, to sort of insert themselves into the cultural narrative. So how do, and specifically my interest a lot with LGBTQ people, you know, how do they use, you know, the Legend of Korra to respond to a culture that largely ignores them, and how can they insert themselves into the world, and how do they, not only how do they insert themselves, but then how they actually are as participatory in the construction of these texts, these media artifacts, as much, if not more, than like the literal illustrators and voice actors and writers, because these worlds become so much bigger and more complex, right? When you're looking at the conversations going on online, the fan art, those kinds of things.
So, as a fan of Buffy,
Yeah.
Tara and Willow's relationship was something that at the time there was some representation, but there wasn't a lot. And it, if I recall correctly, and it's been quite a while since I've really delved into like Buffy behind the scenes lore, my understanding was there were some on the writing team that really wanted to show that relationship really explicitly, and not in the way of like HBO Game of Thrones, you know, hardcore kind of stuff, but just to really make sure that that relationship was even more explicit than it actually was portrayed. And then they were told kind of at the network level, no, you need to tone it down, this is already too much, you know, people maybe aren't ready for this, which was frustrating. It was frustrating for fans, it was frustrating for some of the creators. And then we kind of move in forward a little bit in time to things like The Legend of Korra, where, and I haven't seen it, so I don't know much about it, but my understanding was that the representation for the relationship in that show really didn't come until almost the last episode. Like there was hints of it, and then the fans kind of grabbed onto that and made it clear that they were very supportive of it, but they really weren't allowed to actually fully represent it in the canon until the very last episode. So do you see, fandom obviously is really supportive of the representation, and the network level is kind of the ones that are shying away from it, but do you see the fandom's power going to further representation and going, we are no longer going to let you wait until the very end of a show to do this, you've got to represent us, you got to represent us now, and as a fandom we're going to make our voice heard? Do you think that's more and more as of late?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I also really love She-Ra, and spoilers for anyone watching this, so just know that spoilers are coming. But so at the end of that show, you have the main character, the sort of main protagonist, and largely throughout the show, the antagonist until the end, Catra. They have, and they fulfill it on show. And it takes the whole season, or the whole 5 seasons. But it's really well done. It's not sort of in a like, oh, we're not going to show it to you. It's like, no, we're going to build this really beautiful love story. And it takes that long. And so I think that you are slowly starting to see it. I'm always, when we talk about, you know, do fandoms have power? I think it's always a really complicated story, right? I think, yes, in a lot of ways, networks, studios, you know, the people who are largely engaged in the production for profit, yeah, they want to respond to trends. And so sometimes there is this like, oh, well, we see popularity. But, you know, they're always also looking at a larger picture of, you know, how is this going to play? How is it going to play internationally? And so, you know, I think that like, yeah, sometimes I think we are pushing it and we are starting to see more representation. But also I think that there is this move sometimes where, you know, it's like, well, it's like the Korra thing where it's like, oh, can we do it? Maybe we'll hint at it in the last episode. Now, subsequently, they've released some comics and novels, and they do explicitly explore, right? And so I think, you know, there is that. But then, you know, some shows, like I'm a big fan of Supernatural, which is now just, you know, wrapping up after 15 seasons. And I haven't seen the last season, but
Mm.
you know, one of its there's always been this big, you know, Destiel is one of the big
Hmm.
fandom ships, right? And
Right.
this has been something that's been hinted at since the fourth season in 15 seasons, right? And they
Hmm.
clearly know. I mean, they have a fandom episode, right?
Yeah.
They joke about it, and they joke about, I mean, like, many characters comment on this like obvious relationship that everyone can see. And so in some ways they're saying, oh, well, look, we're responding to fans, but
Mm.
um
But they're stopping just
they're
short.
just short. And you know, I think as a person, you know, as a feminist, I think, scholar, we might comment on why we still as a culture have these kinds of reluctant things.
Mhm.
I think the other aspect of sort of do fandoms influence media is that the idea that of fans in general,
Mhm.
um, and them being involved is a relatively contemporary context. Not that they're not, fans are new,
Mhm.
but this idea that you would be interested in what your fans are saying and allow
Mhm.
them to have influence and have their interests influence the text. There was
Mhm.
this big deal with, you know, with The Witcher, and there was an article written about how the showrunners and the writers were interested in what fans were saying and what a big deal that was. And that has not always been the case. And in fact,
Mhm.
if you look at the history, there's been a lot of antagonism of
Mhm.
fans, and sort of it almost being like, okay, calm down, you're a bit obsessive, stay away. And so I think that, like, we're still coming out of that, this idea,
Mhm.
you know, that fans are not just this sort of bothersome horde to be, you know, sort of kept back, but know that maybe there's something to be
Mhm.
responded to.
Well, and that's interesting too with Supernatural. So to kind of avoid as many spoilers as possible for season 15, they have been again touching upon the idea of the Destiel, the Dean and Castiel relationship, and they've been playing it almost opposite of the relationship that Sam has with another character. And so they're directly paralleling quotes and lines and body language from this heterosexual relationship that Sam is having with Dean and Cass. And at the same time, the fans know, they know that they do not have any intentions on delivering on
Yeah.
this relationship. It's, you know, there's, I think, 5 more episodes to air before it's all completely done, and there's not enough time. There's even questions about whether all of the characters are even going to survive or not, let alone
Right.
have relationships. So it's, but they keep the term for those who don't know is called queerbaiting, and basically they try to have their cake and eat it too, in that, you know, we're going to hint at this relationship for those who are interested in it, but then we're going to play like, oh, no, 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 they're just really good friends. And then they go back and forth constantly, and this show, I think, more so than some of the others, they've in conventions they've spoken about it, and they say, well, but then so they'll say no, they'll say, you know, this is not happening in the story, but then they'll make jokes that, you know, that are teasing almost. And it's very, very frustrating to fans who think that all of the it's not just fans reading into it, it's there, it's in the text, it almost couldn't get more explicit, you know, that this is what's happening. And at the same time they're like, oh, he just
Yeah.
kidding. And on with websites like Twitter now, there is a direct line between the fans and the actors, the fans and the showrunners. They go to conventions, they ask questions, they do Q&As, and just I can't imagine, it's going to be the most frustrating thing.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and in fact, you know, because this was the fandom that really transitioned me to, from just being a person who had things that I was a fan of
mhm,
into the world of fandom.
mhm,
It was sort of a point in my life. I was out of college and sort of trying to be a writer, and not being very successful. And so it was this time, and I'd sort of heard of it. So I kind of like binged Supernatural, and then had heard that, you know, there's all this conversation going around it.
mhm,
And you know, I think that we have this weird thing in our culture where, you know, on this one hand, we we clearly love stories. I mean, we have such a tremendous, I mean, you look at like sort of the Hollywood establishment and how many resources we put to the construction of these stories and publishing. And so when, you know, on the one hand, we're like story obsessed. On the other hand, when then you're sort of like, yeah, I love these stories. They have impact on my life. And suddenly people, whoa, like you're so obsessed. Like, why are you like, it's just a show, like calm down.
Right.
And
well, yeah, it was Supernatural. They started out, whoa, guys, this is a little weird for us, and then they embraced it. They, as you said, they literally had that entire episode called fan fiction, where it was a love letter, really, to fandom, and the cast and the crew seem all very supportive of fan culture. You know, they love seeing the fan art. They love, you know, talking with the fans about theories. And they're supportive of it, but at the same time, in terms of the Destiel ship, they're still kind of holding us at arm's length on one topic. You know, everything else they seem to have embraced, but it's so frustrating that one topic itself has been like, oh, but not that one.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I love Supernatural as a fandom. So when I think back to college, I was in college 2009 to 2013, 2014. And so that encapsulates 2012, which I think of the year as like peak Tumblr, which was like peak fandom. You know, it was the super Hulock crossovers, you know, which we all, for Tumblr people, we joke those are the dark times, but it was peak fan culture. And I just
sort of as a side note, talking about like anthropologists, I follow a number of YouTubers. I'm sure a lot of people are following the same, but speaking of the super Hulock, Lindsay Ellis just did a video on essentially super Hulock, how it evolved. Part of that fandom evolved into this romance genre,
the Omegaverse video.
And so I think that it's interesting, like in that way, talking about how fandoms have real power, right? In that, like, you have these communities creating these things, subsequently it evolves into a genre, money gets involved, and now suddenly you're having these sort of uninitiated, I love these like lawyers and federal judges trying to understand these things. And in some ways very humorous, and they're, I think, also very serious in some implications. But it's so fun. Like, I'm watching, you know, this unfold, and I want to be like, you know, come to like one of Warren's classes and we'll sort you all out. Like, I'm seeing this future where I'm like, could I be like a professional witness, like explaining to these people, you know, genre and, you know, transmediated story worlds, because, you know, it's actually like evolving, and that's where I believe that actually where fandom does have a lot of power.
So for my patrons who have no idea, and I couldn't expect them to have an idea, so Lindsay Ellis is a YouTuber who talks critically about media and media literacy, and she did a video called Into the Omegaverse. And Omegaverse is a trope that originated in the Supernatural fandom, and then it was taken and appropriated by authors creating original works, and they were using the same sort of plot devices in their own, and then it became a thing, well, I created this so I can copyright it, and then I can issue DCMA takedowns on your content to make sure that you don't earn any money on your stories as an author. And it became this sort of battle between, and honestly, they're not like the James Pattersons of the world, they're not big name authors, these are just people who are making a couple bucks off their stories. But the video itself, and I will link it in the description of this video because it is a wild ride, but it goes from fan culture to the creation of a whole new literary genre or subgenre to can you copyright literary tropes and devices? And it's this wild ride that all originated in fandom.
Right. In this time period. 2012, you know, which is sort of this height, I think. For me, really, you know, I, like you said, sort of referred to as the dark times of Tumblr or whatever, but like actually, I think this height of really amazing interaction going on.
Oh yeah.
I mean, not the drama stuff. I think that's always like super tedious, but just the collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a time for growth and for really feeling out too what the internet could contribute. Because remix culture, which is something that we definitely saw a lot about, at least in the early era of the emerging media digital arts course. Remix culture is very interesting in terms of copyright, in terms of, actually using different tools available to us through new technologies. So when we talk about fandom, we end up talking not only just about, oh, I like this story, which is valid on its own, but we end up talking about technology. We end up talking about legality. We end up talking about genres and writing styles. And it's just, I come back to this idea that fandom is a microcosm of society quite
Hmm.
often. So how did you get started in fandom? Were you very young? I mean, because you said that you really started exploring it more after you got into college, but did you ever have any inklings of it as a child?
Yeah, I think a couple of ways. My parents were big readers and read to me a lot. Um, but I was actually, I had just thought, because I had never really been done a lot of fan fiction, but I remember actually in the sixth grade, we had to write a story where a character comes to life. And I actually wrote in the sixth grade Harry Potter fan fiction. And I think like a lot of people at that time, Harry Potter was coming out right when I was in middle school,
Mm-hmm.
and I got involved in that. Of course, now, with all the controversy going on, I'm sort of like having this like grappling conscience. Like, this is this thing that entered me. Like, I was one of those kids who literally refused to read until the Harry Potter books came, and
Mm-hmm.
sort of changed this whole trajectory of my life. But that's really where I entered. And then the other one was Star Trek. Funny enough,
Mm.
my dad, he really liked it, and it was on at the same time Power Rangers was on. And
Oh.
I was always allowed to watch, after school cartoons, but when that happened, we had to watch Star Trek. And there was this one time where, for whatever reason, he wasn't there or had to nap or something. I don't remember. And I was like, I was going to get to watch Power Rangers. And instead, I turned it to Star Trek because we had been, and that's sort of like, it was that other big fandom um, that really set off, sort of this identity of being a nerd and liking those kinds of things.
I love that. Well, and it's so, and I have a totally half-baked thought here, because you were talking about how fandom was something that you did, that you bonded with your father. You were
Hmm.
watching nerd culture stuff. I the to go back to that Lindsay Ellis video, I just watched that with my mother, like, and trying to explain, because there's a lot of things that Lindsay talks about where it's just, it if you're a part of it, it if you've been there. So trying to explain a lot of that was really interesting, because she's been with me watching all of these things. She and I watch horror movies. She and I started Supernatural together. So she understood part of it, and then taking her on this wild ride with me was just really interesting. But she was willing to go there, and willing to talk about it with me. So do you ever have discussions like with family members or friends who maybe aren't part of fandoms in the same way, where they either give you like a different perspective on the culture, or they make you really like examine how it works? Or have you had any experiences like that?
Yeah, I think, so I think fairly similar, where like, my parents, my mom we read a lot of books like C.S. Lewis's The Narnia Chronicles. And so was always participatory there. My mom loves like cop dramas. And so my parents are fans. My dad loves sci-fi and history. But I think for them, it is very much just a like, oh, well, I watched the show.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started doing these things, they've always been very supportive and would listen to me, but definitely that sort of reaction, sort of like, well, I'm aware of, these things you watch, but, and it
Mm-hmm.
was always the same way, because like I was also big into like Dungeons and Dragons and gaming. And so that these things, which they were always aware of, not realizing the culture that was there, and they're
Mm-hmm.
pre-internet. And so I think that's a big change, kind of like you said, that the internet really connected these kinds of groups in a way that we had never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
But then I have my mom's sister and her wife. They are big into fandoms,
Mm.
and we're obviously, are older than me, but we're finding fix of the things that they liked, finding,
Mm-hmm.
had read a lot of like Star Trek Voyager fan fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and like meeting and knowing the people who, finding who wrote them, and we're big in, they're big into fantasy and sci-fi. And so that for them, even though they're sort of like pre the sort of YouTube, when I show them, they're immediately totally engaged. I'm showing them these YouTubers are sort of doing this fandom anthropology, sort of as you speak, and they're super interested because they're like, oh, before it was kind of like you maybe knew one or two people, so they're really excited that there's this
Mm-hmm.
huge world. So I've like had both with these family members. Ones were like, wow, that's so weird, cool, but weird. And others being like, oh my gosh, like this, it's amazing that you can find all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So
With Star Trek, it was much harder in the early days of that fandom because you kind of had to do the fanzines and you had to physically put things together. You had to physically mail things to each other.
yeah.
It took a lot more effort. But I remember, gosh, it was probably 5 or so years ago. My dad went through a huge podcast kick, and since he was a Harry Potter fan too, he would get like all the Muggle nets and the Leaky
Mm-hmm.
Cauldrons and stuff, and I think it might have been MuggleNet, or maybe it was someone similar. But they had a whole, series of episodes dedicated to talking about fanfics in particular. And so my dad comes home and he's listening to his podcast. He's like, "Okay, talk to me about this because I didn't know this was a thing." And
Right.
I feel like if my dad was growing up in this generation, he would have totally been into the whole fandom culture thing. Like
Yeah.
he would have been just as intense about it as I am. And so I find it interesting. I'm very curious about what the future of fandom is going to be because, as the technology gets easier and easier to access and to use, we're going from handwritten letters, snail mailing it, 2 to 3 weeks until somebody reads your Star Trek fan fiction, to my dad just being able to push a button and download a podcast that
Right.
explains everything to him. Do you have thoughts on where fandom is going in the future?
I think it's really interesting. I mean, so, one thing for me, like, I have some of these old fandoms that I'm really disappointed, like,
Mm,
they basically happened on the internet in a way that, like, I wasn't really around for. Like, I'm a big
mm,
Stargate fan, and, like,
mm,
discovering that there was this, like, thriving fandom on the early parts of the internet at a time when I just didn't even realize that it was going
mm,
on. And so now it's not, because fandoms sort of have this time period where they're really active, and
mm,
and so there's and to now where it's like it's guaranteed if I like something I can go and be a part of that community right now. um,
mm,
and as far as where it's going, I'm not sure. Obviously as digital platforms change, I think that that's going to be I mean, it was so vibrant on Tumblr, and now that Tumblr really has significantly diminished, where is the hub? I
mm,
also think that right now culturally we're having a conversation about at least a little bit the power that some of these, in some ways these social media platforms have done some really wonderful things, right?
mm,
But also we know, my other degree is in political science. And so, for instance, it's like I use Facebook a lot and do a lot of fandom stuff there, but also like I know that it's spreading a lot of fake news, right? And so
mm,
I'm like, as a fandom cultural person, I'm like, oh my gosh, well, what will we do without something like Facebook? And on the other
mm.
hand, I'm like, well, maybe we should get rid of it, right? And so, I think that, barring complete collapse, there will be these digital platforms. But for
Mhm.
me, the interesting thing is because fandoms have been mobilized to make such tremendous money, right?
Yeah.
Because now you can like supernatural success, right? Like a pretty like low budget kind of niche thing, and
And it
suddenly
lasted 15 seasons
right,
because it was
you can
CW's cash
harness,
cow.
yeah, and you can harness this, right? And so in some ways I'm like, great, like it's the height of the nerd, they're going to cater to us, but also, there's this, because we're so lucrative, you can, in catering to that, sometimes it becomes like, well, when's the next Supernatural reboot, right? Like, is it
Yeah.
going to literally be 4 years and then we're rebooting Supernatural? Like,
Well, and the actors are already talking about it. I mean, the show hasn't ended yet, and they're talking movies or the Netflix reboot or the HBO reboot so they could swear. And it's like, guys, you ended this because you felt like you had already gotten everything out of the story that you could possibly get.
Like, for me, like, we're in the like era of Star Trek, right? You have, Discovery's just launched the 3rd season. I love the Lower Decks. I think it's just one long Star Trek joke. And you have Picard, who is like, this is this person who got me into social justice. Like, we're in the era of Trek, and yet, as a lover of sci-fi, I'm like, this is this IP is over 50 years old, and are we not going to get real new space opera? It's so expensive to produce that it's like, well, we know if we do Trek, Trekkies will come. Like,
we're gonna buy the merch,
right? But a new one, that's a risk, right? I mean, basically, we had The Expanse. Like, that's been the other, and obviously not a new IP. It was a book first, but like, so in those ways in which fandom is so powerful, I'm wondering, will it become so much more limited, particularly as we know that media companies are condensing, where it's like, you'll have fandoms, but essentially there'll be this canon that we just perpetually recreate.
So do you think then, so what you're saying is that because the power of fandom, because we buy the merch and we I mean, like Veronica Mars, they did a Kickstarter to get the movie to happen, and then because the network saw the power of that, they went on with that. I think it was the 4th season.
Yep.
While showrunners are very happy to kind of suck a story dry until there's literally nothing left, but fans are equally happy to do that.
Yes.
And so, in terms of seeing things from major studio networks, the innovation's not going to be there. So, but also at the same time, I'm seeing a lot of problems with YouTube just in terms of how they run the company. And so for a long time, I thought maybe YouTube would be the future of storytelling, because you didn't have to wait for a green light to go with your project. You just go and you make it. But that's not what seems to be happening with YouTube. So what is it, I wonder, going to take to find a platform that's welcoming enough to where we can get these new fresh stories that aren't book reboots, that aren't, Doctor Who 100 years later? I wonder how we make that happen.
Well, I think that, I mean, it's going to be hard. I work in publishing, and along with, my sort of traditional fandoms, I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I mean, like right now, for instance, short stories, the short story online, I mean, it's just so vibrant. And you are really seeing, just the representation is much better than you're seeing in visual media, as far as representation of, the full beautiful spectrum of human diversity, right? The Vulcan infinite combinations and infinite possibilities sort of thing, right? And books too, like Tor.com, which kind of, you have Macmillan, and then you had their imprint Tor, and then now Tor.com, and how they've sparked this novella resurgence and really, took a risk on it, and it's paid off for them. So they're continuing it, and really some amazing stories coming out of there. And so the literary world, I think right now is into innovation. So the stories are getting created. I think, where it comes to is, I think some of these places are great for fandom creation, but our relationship where, are we satisfied with being perpetually having our nostalgia? It is super, I mean, and I fall into it. I think, Supernatural stopped being good, like, possibly 6 seasons ago, but I definitely watch it. Like, I will
Right.
continue to watch the new Star Treks, even though in my mind I'm sort of like, this is being made at the expense of. And so I'm not sure what we do as fans. Where on the one hand, you know, if they came to me and said, write a Star Trek novel, I mean, I would die. Like,
Right.
it would be so amazing. And yet, do we need another one of those? You know,
Right.
how do I be supportive of those creators who get to write the new Supernatural, the new Star Treks? Because I'm like, that's so cool. And yet at the same time, I'm like, you know, when are we gonna, you know, we need some of evolution, some growth. So I don't know if I have any answers for that.
Yeah. I would I started out of curiosity reading the supernatural novels, and I have been nothing but disappointed so far. I and it's I can't say that it's the era in which they were written in, because it was towards the beginning of the show, but just the writing itself was subpar. So if somebody came to me and said, "Hey, you could fix this. Use the same plot lines but write it better," I would
Right.
be like, "Yeah, yeah, there's no question. I'm doing this." But at the same time, it's just so we I mean, we make shows about, I just introduced my dad to Ready Player One. He was like, what is Ready Player One? And so I brought the movie home for him, and he watched it, and he was silent the whole time, and then he was like, oh, okay. And it's I was trying to explain it to my parents, and it's like, it's everything you loved about the 80s, but it made you sad.
Right.
Because they took what you actually loved about it and they sucked it out and threw it all together in a blender and said, you like this, remember this, remember this? And it's like,
Well,
I don't.
commodified it.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, I loved some of these individual pieces, but as a whole, this is not working for me. And I feel like a lot of times the fandoms that are really kind of hanging in there long after their time, we get so excited because it's like, oh, that was a really good scene in a horrible episode, but maybe next week's episode will be better.
Right.
I find myself doing that constantly with Supernatural. I'm just like, that was a beautiful scene, that was a beautiful thread to the story. Okay, and then we ruined it this week. Oh, but maybe next week it'll be better.
But you
So
know, you'll have the conversation, you'll have Sam and Dean at the end, and you'll have the single man tier, and it'll pull our heartstrings because we love them. and
right.
and we'll do it then. We're like, okay, well, now I forgive them because they're just so good, and so I'll be back next week.
I'm wondering if it's the characters. And for me, like, I'm hanging in there for the characters, not the plot lines, not the production, not even the script writing anymore. Because, oof, But we love characters so much. I mean, sort of the Kingdom Hearts thing. We take the characters and we put them somewhere else because we just don't want to let go of these characters.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So I want to touch upon. So you were a political science major as well.
Yeah.
And in with the other person that I was speaking to, I kind of briefly touched upon the idea that fandom and the way that it organizes itself, like the way they say, oh, I'm gonna write to the network executives to get a whole new season, or I'm gonna from Supernatural, you're aware of Gish, right? The scavenger hunt that Misha Collins does?
Yeah.
With Gish, he motivates the power of his fandom, and they support charity because they know him, they know what he's from. And I wonder if that same power from a fandom could be maybe harnessed similarly for political activism. If you would mind speaking about that just a little bit.
Yeah, actually, so it's super funny. I actually had the opportunity to go for someone who their PhD dissertation was on this idea of, do fandoms, can they politically organize? Essentially outside the fandom, can they organize this? And it was essentially on the Wizard Rock community. And
I
so
love it.
looked at essentially did this sort of comparison between a traditional political organization in the state and then Wizard Rock, and it was whatever, and I think so. Yeah, there is some potential. I think that I always come back to this, like, politics is really complicated, right? And so I think that, like, any group, like any community, there's like it can be harnessed, right? And in one way, for instance, like if you look at the Harry Potter wars, which is an early example, and I keep on regretting that I have to go to Harry Potter. It's just such a good example. But
Right.
you had this thing where you really did have fans organizing around an issue they were passionate about. You have this large company, Warner Brothers, going after fan creation and them organizing around that, and that it did change the direction the company was going. So I think that for me, I do believe in that, but like any community, it has to be something, it's like, I don't necessarily believe that like we're gonna organize the supernatural fandom to fight malaria, right? Like maybe
Mm-hmm.
do a fundraiser or whatever. I think that politics has to be intimately related to you and that community. And so maybe not to fight malaria, but maybe supernatural fans can mobilize to, help deal with like companies abusing digital copyright programs,
Mm.
right?
So to bring it home to where it impacts the fans
Yeah.
in their work.
And that, because the sense of community is around stories and media. And
Mm.
so if I'm going to participate in that, or how like, I think that the actors, they have done things around like mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
and getting support for that, and,
Mm-hmm.
and relating their own experiences. And I think a lot of fans who may personally relate to that. And so that you can, I think that if it is to be politically harnessed, it has to be in a way that relates to how are you a part of that community,
Mm-hmm.
and so
Or
then
to a part of the story. I mean, I vaguely remember, it was the Harry Potter Alliance, I think it was called, and it was the rocking out against Voldymedia, and it
yeah,
was basically saying Voldemort in the story shut down and turn basically the wizarding world's media into propaganda, and therefore how do we fight propaganda in the real world. And so it was taking the story and using it as an allegory for what's happening in our own world. And so you're saying that in order to really successfully use fandom to power political activism, it has to relate to either something that affects the fans or that's something that was a plot point within the story itself.
and that they might relate to in being, in that feeling of community, that it's like, no, like we all acknowledge, like I'm a big fan of this author Max Gladstone, and he's written these really beautiful fantasy books around sort of post-industrial capitalism, but using fantasy and necromantic lawyers. But in the last book in the series, it's not finished, but in the one most recently published, he has this sort of dedication to that there's a lot of things we're facing, and that we need artists and creators and craftswomen, and he's relating it to this text and this call for us that we need to do these things. And it was like incredibly moving, and his books are so political, and so in a way I'm not surprised, but I'm reading it and I'm like almost crying, because it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, I do need to get into the fight, like and so I think like in that way he understood, he had a clear enough vision of how his work could be speaking to us to make that call that was motivating. And I think that that's how we can mobilize these communities.
I love it. That's beautiful. So is there anything else fandom wise that we haven't addressed that you would love to just kind of info dump on, or?
I just think, for me right now, where I'm really interested is, I think sometimes we get caught up in this idea, it either can do something or it can't do something. And to me, that's very binary.
Mm-hmm.
But more so that I think like where we have real power is that we can create these worlds and they do have cultural impact. And I always think of like, Star Trek, there's this famous episode, Measure of a Man, and for any fans, they know it. It's where Data is essentially declared a person, a non-human person, right? And for me, I don't necessarily consider myself a political activist. I have done activist work, I have lobbied, I have tried to address these things, and I know that those stories had impact on me. I don't think it was literally like, I watched this beautiful story of them choosing social justice and that was the instant switch, but it is a part of my narrative, this idea that we try and be as inclusive as possible. And so I think that right now I online I see a lot of arguments where, like, on the one side there's this like, no, we have to write great stories because they totally fix everything, and yeah, but we also got to vote, and we also got to go and be in protests, and there's a lot of other work to be done. We don't just get to write fabulous stories and it's the end. But I think that there's this other cynical side that it's like, well, they have no impact. Like, you aren't fixing racism or poverty by writing a story about it. Like, that's meaningless. And I think that that's cynical and not true. I think that these things just understand their impact, and the impact is that we're shaping the narrative, like, in some way. We're creating this possibility. And that in that way, like, it is incredibly important to let studios know that, like, hey, the reason that Destiel is so important is because you haven't told the full potential of stories. If you told the full potential of stories, we wouldn't care about Destiel, right? But because you haven't, we now have to build this world for you. Basically, we're doing your job, writers and execs are like, kind of taking care of business because you refuse.
Right.
And I definitely think that I believe that it has power and impact, because from my media, when I really started paying attention to stories, back in like 2005 versus now, it has shifted, and it's not perfect, but there is more of a conversation. So I think
it's a great way to start a conversation. If you see something, you watch something, and you're like, oh, I'm just going to enjoy this. And then you don't realize it kind of as you go, you're learning, and you're internalizing somebody else's story and creating empathy for these other people who are going through situations that maybe you never faced or never would face.
For me, I think the biggest example is Star Trek. Star Trek is my original fandom. And, I figured out that I was a queer person watching Captain Kirk, and that was sort of my awakening to, like, oh, I might experience, this attraction. And, there was never queer people. And then I got to, as an adult person, watch explicit queer men be in Star Trek, So we waited half a century, but we got it. Like, it did happen. And so I know, because I saw those different things where it was, explicitly never going to happen, no matter what writers or actors wanted to, it definitely did happen in the space of one human's life. And I'm 31 years old. I'm not even done yet, right? So, so these things do, like, they can change.
That's amazing. I love it. I don't even have anything amazing to say about that, because it speaks for itself, Great. Wow. So that's all the questions I've got for you. Thank you so much. I love this conversation. I love being able to introduce my patrons to fandom and to I was talking with somebody, and it's just, it's like we started out in the shadows, really, with fan culture, and now we're to the point where it's like we're not even using because like Tumblr was a place where it was like, this is where your fan stuff goes, and then your real life is over stuff is on Facebook and Twitter. But the new generation, they're putting it out on their Facebooks and their Twitter. They're talking to their grandparents about their ships, and it's so mainstream that we don't necessarily even need. I mean, like, I love Tumblr. I'm still going to spend my time on that black hole of a website, but like it's not necessary to be where you hide your fan culture anymore. It can be out in the open, and I see fan culture merging more and more with just everyday life, and I'm excited to see where that takes us.
Me too, definitely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.